Hey, and welcome to the first short lecture from Chapter 3 in your textbook. As you can see here, our unit this time focuses on the development of scientific management, bureaucracy, and the modern organization. And so we'll begin today's short lecture by talking a little bit about the modern organization and how it relates, or how its genesis relates to the Industrial Revolution. So when we think about the organization, we have to realize that it is, relatively speaking, kind of a new phenomena. And the modern iteration of the organization is based largely on industrial concepts of space and time. Now, it seems obvious, right? But organizations, as we understand them, depend on people showing up at a particular place and time, right? Nowadays, we're doing a lot of that online, obviously, like we're doing with this short lecture. But ultimately, it's the organization necessitates or needs people to show up at the same place and the same time. So this idea that you should go to work with a bunch of other people for someone else and earn a wage instead of being an entrepreneur is pretty new. Indeed, as late as the 1850s, the idea of working for an employer, a big organization, instead of yourself was called wage slavery, right? It was looked down upon. So again, as late as the 1850s, people thought that this notion of working for other people in a big company, in an organization, going to work in a factory, was crazy. That it was just a bad way to make a living. Indeed, they thought it was a direct contradiction of the freedom and independence that the country was founded on. They thought it was un-American to go work for a big company. And so what we find is that the term employee, for example, didn't even exist until the late 1800s. And when it was used then, it was only used to describe railroad workers, people who worked on the railroad, and in pejorative terms. So that means it was a bad way of talking about people. So to be an employee in the late 1800s meant that you probably worked for the railroad, and the people looked down on you because you didn't work for yourself, right? You worked for an organization. So what we see then is that this shift, right, from workers to managers and employees, the idea that you don't just you're not just a worker working for yourself, but you're an employee who works with a manager or for a manager, has to do with changes in jobs, as well as really a more fundamental or basic transformation in collective beliefs, values, and cultural practices. So let me. I think one of the things that we encounter a lot in organizational comm and in communication in general is that a lot of the writing is hyperbolic, meaning it's sort of overdone, right? It's over exaggerated. But in this case, when we say that there's a fundamental transformation of collective beliefs, values, and cultural practices, it's kind of true, right? There was a significant shift in the way people viewed the world that came with modernity and the Industrial Revolution. When we entered into the modern era, right, and people went to work for others instead of themselves, moved to cities from the country. We saw major changes in communication, things like the telephone, the telegraph, the radio. As these things developed, along with changes in transportation, the steam locomotive, for example, people began to view the world in a very fundamentally different kind of way. And so that's what your book means when it talks about a fundamental transformation in collective beliefs, values, and cultural practices. So again, the Industrial Revolution produces a major transformation in Western society. And this was hastened, or this change was sped up in Europe and the United States by the invention of steam power and the emergence of mechanical high-volume production, right? So what that means is once we figured out how to harness the power of steam to make things run, we could begin to make things very rapidly, very quickly, right? And we had all this machinery that helped us, like you see here in the photograph. And all of that changes the way that people look at work and how they work. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, what you saw is that we had an agricultural and mercantile system. So what that means is that our economy was based on people growing food, right, on farming, and on mercantile trade. So in other words, taking things that people make and trading them, right, import, export, that kind of thing. Merchants selling things at the corner store and such, right? So once the Industrial Revolution came along, this shifted. We were no longer an agricultural based economy. We became an industrial economy. So this Industrial Revolution, if you don't remember from your previous history classes, begins in Britain around 1780, but it doesn't really get started in the U.S. until around 1880. So the Great Britain, the English, and so on had about a 100-year head start on us. Now, this switch, right, with the Industrial Revolution from self-employment, right, being a farmer or a barrel maker or a wheel maker, right, or whatever it is that you do in your own home workshop, this shift from that kind of work to working for others really got sped up in Europe by the passing of what were called enclosure laws. So a little bit of history. For hundreds of years, prior to the passing of these enclosure laws, poor people had access to what were known as common lands. And on these common lands, they could go out and they could farm, right? They could grow their own crops, and they could raise animals, right? They could have them graze out there. Now, with the passage of enclosure laws in Europe at the end of the 18th century, what we see is that these lands were closed off to the poor, right? The common lands were closed off and given to wealthy landowners. So people who already had, a lot of money and a lot of land, basically got all this common land. They were given this common land. And what that meant was that poor people couldn't provide for themselves any longer. You couldn't go out to the commons and grow your crops and let your cattle graze and so on, right? And so as a result, poor people were left without resources. The only resource they really had was their own labor, right? Their own ability to go out and work. And so if that's all you got, that's all you could sell, right? So as a result, they were forced to sell their labor to others. And this was one of the things that Marx was going on about, as we talked about in some of our previous lectures. He saw the fact that people weren't allowed or weren't able to look out for themselves, right? They couldn't be self-sufficient because the common lands and so on were taken away, and so they were forced to sell the only thing they had left, which was their labor. Now, in the U.S., it took longer for us to get the Industrial Revolution fully underway because we didn't have enclosure laws, right? Indeed, our economy, industrial economy, the beginning of it and its maturation, depended largely on immigrant labor. And of course, the United States still depends a lot on immigrant labor to do much of the actual real physical work that is necessitated by our economy. All right, so again, the Industrial Revolution relied on technology. And when we think about technology today, obviously we think about digital technology. Here we're talking about steam power. We're talking about very early forms of technologies. And this allowed for the mass production of goods, right? We could really start stamping stuff out really fast. And it also changed transportation. And so the argument goes that these technological changes were accompanied by cognitive changes. What that means in simple terms is that with this new technology, it changed the way people thought. So, for example, Wolfgang Schivelbusch, the academic, famously wrote a work about how trains, steam trains, changed the way people thought about time and space. Now, in the hyperbolic vernacular of communications, we say that the coming of steam technology obliterated time and space, right? You'll see people write things like that. And it's not really true. It didn't destroy time and space, but it definitely changed the way we thought about time and space. So, for example, if you grew up in Barnesville back 200 years ago, right? You probably never really ventured much further than maybe 7 miles from your home, right? I mean, you never really got out that often. And if you did travel, you traveled either by horse or by foot, right? So if you wanted to go to Atlanta, which is what, 70 miles away, 60 miles away, what have you, that was a long trip that took several days to get there, right? This idea of time and distance are linked together. But all of a sudden, trains come, right? We have steam power, and you can go from Barnesville to downtown Atlanta in an hour, right? So that's what we mean when we say change the way people thought about time and space. It changed the way they thought about distances, right? Everything moved much more quickly. So they saw technology as overcoming nature, right? Of overcoming organic limitations. With the railroad, we saw railroad tracks going all across the nation, right? They crossed over rivers. Steam power meant that we could go through mountains, right? We could drill our way through mountains. They carved through towns. A lot of the natural forces that affected people's lives became less important, right? I mean, think about it, for example. Think about how different your life would be if you had to go to school without air conditioning, right? I mean, think about how unpleasant it would be, how hard it would be to learn sitting in a classroom in late August in Georgia with it at 110 degrees inside, right? So what people found is they were no longer subject to the whims of wind or horses, right? And so this marks sort of the beginning of humankind losing touch with nature. And I would suggest to you that today we're very out of touch with nature, right? I mean, you walk out to your car during the winter and you turn on the heater, and maybe you're cold for the 30 seconds it takes you to walk from your front door to your car. But then once you get in, the car warms up, you're fine. You don't even think about the fact that it's freezing outside. But if you didn't have that technology, if you had to build a fire to get warm, right, and so on, you'd think a hell of a lot more about nature, wouldn't you? So that's what I mean when I say let's think about this. I'm encouraging you to think about all the benefits of technology that we take for granted and how much that changed the way people live their lives during this period of time. Okay, well, so that sort of wraps things up for the beginning of the corporation and industrial revolution, and we'll continue this in the next short lecture. Thanks for checking this out.